13. Such a swaggering, brash little boy he had been, with no father and only an impoverished, embittered mother to try to make a life for children she had not wanted and did not love. Matt had turned to a life of small crimes and spirited mischief. Most of his time had been spent with a ragtag band of dirty-paced boys who carried out whatever schemes they could to survive. The harshness of his home place led him to thievery and deceit. Had he been grown, he would have been imprisoned or worse. But there had always been a gentle side to Matty, even when he had disguised it. He had loved his dog, a mongrel he had found injured and had nursed back to health, and he had come eventually to love the crippled girl called Kira, who had never known her father, and whose mother had died suddenly and left her alone. Mascot, Kira had called him, laughing. His sidekick, he had made him wash, taught him manners, and told him stories. "I be the fiercest of the fierce," he had bragged to her once. "You are the dirtiest of the dirty faces," she had said, laughing, in reply, and given him the first bath he ever had. He had struggled and protested, but in truth he had loved the feel of warm water. He had never learned to love soap, though Kira gave him some for his own. But he felt the years of grime slip from him and knew that he could turn into someone cleaner, better. Roaming as he always had, Matty had learned the intricate paths of forest. One day he had found his way to village for the first time and had met the blind man there. "She lives?" The blind man had asked him, unbelieving. "My daughter is alive." It was very dangerous for the blind man to return. Those who had tried to kill him, who had left him for dead years before, thought they had succeeded. They would have slain him instantly had he found his way back, but Matty, a master of stealth, had brought him secretly at night to meet his daughter for the first time. He watched from a corner of the room as Kira recognized the broken stone the seer wore as an amulet and matched it to her own, fitting it to the fragment given to her by her dying mother. Matty saw the blind man touch his daughter's face to learn her, and he watched in silence as they mourned Kira's mother together, their hearts connected by the loss. Then, when darkness came the next night, he had led the blind man back again, but Kira would not come, not then. Someday, she had told Matty and her father when they begged her to return with them to village. "I'll come someday. There's time still, and I have things to do here first." "I suppose there's a young man," the blind man had said to Matty as they traveled back without her. "She's the age for it." "Nah," Matty had said scornfully. "Not Kira. She has better stuff on her mind." "Anyways," he had added, referring to her twisted leg, "she has that horrid grimp. No one can marry even they got a gimp. She's lucky they didn't feed her to the beasts. They wanted to. They only kept her 'cause she could do things they needed." "What things?" "She grows flowers and—" "Her mother did too." "Yes, her mom told her, and to make the colors from them." "Dyes?" "Yes, she dyes the threads and then she makes pictures from them. No one else can do it. She has like a magic touch, they say, and they want her for that. She would be honored in village, not only for her talent, but for her twisted leg. Turn here." Matty took the blind man's arm and guided him to the right side of a turning in the path. "Watch the roots there." He noticed that a root lifted itself and stepped slightly at the man's sandaled foot. It made him very nervous, guiding on this return trip, because he could feel, being familiar with it, the forest was giving small warnings to the blind man. He would not be allowed to come through again. "She'll come when she's ready," he reassured Kira's father. "Till then, I'll go back and forth between." But it had been 2 years since he had last seen Kira. Matty emerged from forest with a stumble, blinking at the sudden sunshine, for he had been in the dim thickness of trees for many days now and felt that he had almost forgotten light. He fell on the path and sat there panting, slightly dizzy, with Frolic pawing worriedly at his leg. In the past he had always— what would the word be? strolled from forest, sometimes whistling. But this was different. He felt that he had been expelled, chewed up, and spat out. When he looked back toward the trees and the direction he had come, it seemed inhospitable, unwelcoming, locked down. He knew he would have to re-enter forest and return by those same dark paths that now seemed so ominous. He would have to lead Kira through to the safety of her future with her father, and he knew suddenly that it would be his last journey in that place. There was not much time left, and he would not be able to linger here, to look up his boyhood pals, to reminisce with them about their pranks, or to brag a little about his status now. He usually did when he came. He would not even have time to say goodbye to the stranger his brother had become. Village would close in 3 weeks from the time of the proclamation. Maddie had calculated very carefully. He had counted the days of his journey, adding in the extra days it took for his side trips to tag the messages in place. Now he had just enough time to rest, which he badly needed to do, collect food for the return journey, and persuade Kira to come with him. If they moved steadily and without interruption through forest, though he knew it would be slower with the girl, who had to lean on her stick, they would arrive in time. Maddie blinked, took a deep breath, got to his feet, and hurried on to the small cottage around the next turning, the place where Kira lived. The gardens were larger than he remembered. Since his last visit almost 2 years before, she had expanded them, he saw. Thick clumps of yellow and deep pink flowers fringed the edge of the small dwelling with its hand-hewn beams and thatched roof. Maddie had never paid attention to the names of flowers. Boys generally disdained such things, but now he wished he knew them so that he could tell Jean. Frolic went to the base of a wooden post that was entwined with a purple-blossomed vine, and lifted his leg to proclaim his presence and authority here. The door to the cottage opened, and Kira appeared there. She was wearing a blue dress, and her long dark hair was tied back with a matching ribbon. "Maddie!" she cried in delight. He grinned at her. "And you've got yourself a new pup. I hoped you would. You were so sad, I remember, after Branchy died. His name is Frolic, and I'm afraid he's watering your clematis." "It's all right," she said, laughing. She reached for Maddie and embraced him. Ordinarily uncomfortable with hugs, he would have stiffened his shoulders and drawn back. But now, from exhaustion and affection, he held Kira, and to his own amazement felt his eyes fill with tears. He blinked them back. "All right, stand back now and let me see you," she said. "Are you taller yet than I am?" He stood back grinning and saw that they were eye to eye. "Soon you will be, and your voice is almost a man's." "I can read Shakespeare," he told her, swaggering. "Huh, so can I," she said, and he knew then for certain how changed this village was, for in the earlier days girls had not been allowed to learn. "Oh, Maddie, I remember when you were such a tiny thing and so wild. The fiercest of the fierce," he reminded her, and she smiled fondly at him. "You must be very tired and hungry. You've just made such a long journey. Come inside. I have soup on the fire, and I want news of my father." He followed her into the familiar cottage and waited while she reached for her walking stick that leaned against the wall and arranged it under her right arm. Dragging the useless leg, she took a thick earthen bowl from a shelf and went to the fire where a large pot simmered and smelled of herbs and vegetables. Maddie looked around. No wonder she had not wanted to leave this place. From the sturdy ceiling beams dangled the countless dried herbs and plants from which she made her dyes. Shelves on the wall were bright with rolls of yarn and thread arranged by color. White, the palest yellow at one end, gradually deepening into blues and purples, and then browns and grays at the other. On a threaded loom in the corner between two windows, a half-finished weaving pictured an intricate landscape of mountains, and he could see that she was now working on the sky and had woven in some feathery clouds of pink-tinged white. She set the bowl of steaming soup on the table in front of Maddie, and then went to the sink to pump water into a bowl for Frolic. "Now tell me of father," she asked. "He's well?" "He's fine. He sent you his love." He watched as Kira leaned her stick against the sink and knelt with difficulty to place the bowl on the floor. Then she called to Frolic, who was industrious chewing a broom in the corner. When the puppy had come to her and turned his attention to the bowl of water, Kira rose again, sliced a thick piece from a loaf of bread, wedged her stick under her shoulder again, and brought the bread to the table. Maddie watched the way she walked, the way she had always walked. Her right foot twisted inward, pulling the entire leg with it. The leg had not grown as the other had. It was shorter, turned, and useless. He thanked her and dipped one end of the slice into his soup. "He's a sweet puppy, Maddie." He half listened as she chattered cheerfully about the dog. His thoughts had turned to Frolic's birth and how close to death the pup and his mother had been. He glanced down at her twisted leg. How much more easily she would be able to walk, how much more steadily and quickly she would be able to travel, if the leg were straight, if the foot could be planted firmly on the ground. He remembered the afternoon after Puppy and his mother had been saved. Today he was tired, very tired, from the long journey through forest, but on that day he had felt near death. He tried to recall how long it had taken him to recover. He had slept, he knew. Yes, he remembered that he had slept for the afternoon, glad that the blind man had not been at home to ask why. But he had arisen before dinner, weary still, but able to hide it, to eat and talk as if nothing had happened. So his recovery had taken only a few hours, really. Still, it had been a puppy. Well, a puppy and its mother, 2 dogs. He had fixed, cured, saved 2 dogs in late morning and recovered it by the end of the day. "Maddie, you're not listening. You're half asleep." Kira's laughter was warm and sympathetic. "I'm sorry." He put the last bit of bread into his mouth and looked apologetically at her. "You're both tired. Look at Frolic." He glanced over and saw the puppy sound asleep, curled into a mound of undyed yarn heaped near the door, as if the soft pile were a mother to doze against. "I have work to do in the garden, Maddie. The coreopsis needs digging, and I've not had a chance to get to it. You lie down and get some rest now, while I'm outside. Later we can talk, and you can go into the village and find your friends for a visit." He nodded and went to the couch to lie down on top of the knitted blanket that she had thrown across it. In his mind, he was counting the days they had left. He would explain to her that there was no time to visit with old pals. He watched, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, as she took his bowl to the sink, placed it there, and then, leaning on her stick, gathered some sticks from a shelf and a ball of twine. With the garden tools, she turned to go outdoors. The twisted foot dragged in its familiar way. He had known everything about Kira for so long. Her smile, her voice, her merry optimism, the amazing strength and skill of her hands, and the burden of her useless leg. "I must tell you this," Maddie thought before he slept. "I can't fix you." 14. To his amazement, Kira said no. Not no to leave him. He hadn't suggested that to her, not yet, but a definite, unarguable no to the idea of a straightened whole leg. "This is who I am, Maddie," she said. "It is who I have always been." She looked at him fondly, but her voice was firm. It was evening. The fire glowed in the fireplace, and she had lit the oil lamps. Maddie wished that the blind man were in the room with them, playing his instrument, because the soft, intricate chords always brought a peace to their evenings together, and he wanted Kira to hear the music, to feel the comfort it brought. He had not yet told her that she was to return with him. During their supper together, as Kira chattered about the changes in the old village, how much better things were now, he had only half listened. In his mind, he had been weighing what to tell her and when and how. There was so little time, and he needed, Maddie knew, to present it to her in a decisive and convincing way. But suddenly he heard her make a casual comment about her handicap. She was describing a small tapestry she had embroidered as a wedding gift for her friend Thomas, the woodcarver, who had recently been married. It was all finished and rolled up, and I decorated it with flowers, she said. And on the morning of the wedding, I set out, carrying it. But it had rained, and the path was wet, and I slipped and dropped the tapestry right into a mud puddle, Kira laughed. Luckily, it was still early, so I came back here and was able to clean it. No one ever knew. My leg and stick are a nuisance when it's wet outdoors, she said. My stick has never learned to navigate mud. She reached the pot and began to pour more tea into their mugs. Surprising himself, he blurted it out. I can fix your leg. The room felt completely silent except for the hiss and crackle of the fire. Kira stared at Maddie. I can, he said after a moment. I have a gift. Your father says that you do too, so you will understand. I do, Kira agreed. I always have. But my gift doesn't fix twisted things. I know, your father told me yours is different. Kira looked down at her hands, wrapped around her mug of tea. She opened her fingers, spread her hands upon the table, and turned them over. Maddie could see the slender palms and the strong fingers, calloused at their tips from the garden work, the loom and the needles that she used for her complicated, beautiful tapestries. Mine is in my hands, she said softly. It happens when I make things. My hands. He knew he shouldn't interrupt, but time was so short, so he cut her off and apologized for it. Kira, I want you to tell me all about your gift, but later. Right now, there are important things to do and decide. I'm going to show you something, he told her. Watch this. My gift is in my hands too. He had not planned this, but it seemed necessary. On the table lay the sharp knife with which she had sliced bread for their supper. Maddie picked it up. He leaned down and pulled the left leg of his trousers up. Kira watched, her eyes confused. Quickly, without flinching, he punctured his own knee. Dark red blood trickled in thin crooked line down his lower leg. Oh, Kira gasped. She stared at him and held her hand to her mouth. What? Maddie swallowed, took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and placed both of his hands on his wounded knee. He felt it coming. He felt his veins begin to pulsate. Then the vibration coursed through him, and he felt the power leave his hands and enter his wound. It lasted no more than a few seconds and ended. He blinked and took his hands away. They were smeared slightly with blood. The trickled line on his leg had already begun to dry there. Maddie, whatever are you? When he gestured, Kira leaned forward and looked carefully at his knee. After a moment, she reached for the woven napkin on the table, dipped it into her tea, and wiped his leg with the damp cloth. The line of blood disappeared. His knee was smooth, unblemished. There was no wound at all. She looked intently at it and bit her lip, reached out and pulled the hem of his trouser leg down over his knee. I see. It was all she said. Maddie shook himself free of the wave of fatigue it had caused. It was a very small wound, he explained. I just did it to show you I could. It didn't take much out of me, but I've done it with bigger things, Kira, with other creatures with much larger wounds. Humans? Not yet, but I can do it. I can feel it, Kira, with the gift, you know. She nodded. Yes, that's true. She glanced at her own hands, resting there on the table, still holding the damp cloth. Kira, your leg will take a great deal out of me. I'll have to sleep after maybe a whole day or even longer, and I don't have much time. She looked at him quizzically. Time for what? I'll explain. But for now, I think we should start. If I do it right away, I can sleep completely through the night and almost all of the morning. You can use that time to become accustomed to being whole. I am whole, she said defiantly. I meant to having two strong legs. You'll be amazed at how it feels and how much more easily you can move around. But it will take a little while you two adjust it. She stared at him. She looked down at her twisted leg. Why don't you lie down over there on the couch? I'll pull this chair over and sit beside you. Matty began kneading his hands in preparation. He took several deep breaths and felt energized. He could tell that his full strength was back. The knee wound had been such a small thing, really. He rose, lifted his wooden chair, and moved it over beside the couch where he had napped that afternoon. He arranged the cushions so that she would be comfortable. Behind him, he heard Kira rise from her chairs as well, lift her stick from where it leaned against the table, and walk across the room. To his surprise, when he turned, he saw that she had taken the mugs to the sink and was beginning to wash them, as if it were an ordinary evening. Kira? She looked over at him. She frowned slightly. Then she said no. There was no arguing with her, none at all. After a while, Matty gave up the attempt. Finally, he moved his chair again so that he could sit in front of the fire. It was chilly in the evenings now, with summer ending. Forrest had been downright cold at night, and he had woken in the mornings during his journey, aching and chilled. It was comforting to sit here by the warm fire now. Kira picked up a small wooden frame with a half-finished piece of embroidery stretched taut across it. She brought it to her chair and moved a basket filled with bright threads to the floor beside her. Then she leaned her stick against the fireplace wall, sat down, and picked up the needle that was waiting threaded with green attached to the fabric. I will go with you, she said quite suddenly in her soft voice. But I will go as I am, with my leg, with my stick. Matty, puzzled, stared at her. How had she known, before she asked it, what he was planning to ask of her? I was going to explain, he said after a long moment. I was going to persuade you. How? I started to tell you earlier, she said, about my gift, what my hands do. Move your chair closer and I'll show you now. He did so, pulling the crude wooden chair near to where she was. She tilted the embroidery frame so that he could see. Like the colorful tapestry on the wall of Blind Man's house, this was a landscape. The stitches were tiny and complicated, and each section a subtle variation in color, so that deep green moved gradually into a slightly lighter shade, and then again lighter, until the edges it was a pale yellow. The colors combined to form an exquisite pattern of trees, with the tiniest of individual leaves outlined in countless numbers. It's forest, Matty said, recognizing it. Kira nodded. Look beyond it, she said, and extended her finger to point to a section in the upper right, where forest opened and tiny houses were patterned around the curved path. He thought he could almost make out the house he shared with the blind man, though it was infinitely small on the fabric. Village, he said, examining with awe the meticulousness of her craft. I embroider this scene again and again, Kira said. And sometimes, not always, my hands begin to move in ways I don't understand. The threads seem to take on a power of their own. He leaned closer to look more carefully at the embroidery. It was astounding, the detail of it, how tiny it was. Matty, she said, I've never done this with anyone watching, but I can feel it in my hands right now. Watch. He peered intently as her right hand picked up the needle threaded with green. She inserted it into the fabric at an unfinished place near the edge of forest. Suddenly, both of her hands began to vibrate slightly. They shimmered. He had seen this once before, on the day that Leader stood at the window, gathered himself, and saw beyond. He looked up at her face and saw that her eyes were closed, but her hands were moving very quickly now. They reached into the basket again and again, changed threads in a motion so fast he could barely follow it. And the needle entered the cloth and entered the cloth and entered the cloth. Time seemed to stop. The fire continued to crackle and sputter. Frolic sighed in his sleep at the edge of the hearth. Maddie sat speechless, watching the shimmering hand start. Hours and days and weeks seemed to go by, yet oddly, only a blink, an instant of time passed. Today and tomorrow and yesterday were all spun together and held in those hands that moved and moved and moved. Yet her eyes were closed, and the fire still flickered, and the dog still slept. Then it ended. Kira opened her eyes, sat up straightener, and stretched her shoulders. "It tires me," she explained, though he already knew it. "Look now," she said, quickly, "because it will fade." He leaned forward and saw that now, in the embroidered scene, at the bottom, two tiny people were entering forest. He recognized one as himself, backpack on his back. He could even see, amazingly, the torn place on the sleeve of his jacket. Behind him, meticulously stitched in shades of brown, was Frolic, his tail high. And beside Frolic, he saw Kira, but her blue dress, her stick wedged under her arm, her dark hair tied back. The top edge of the embroidery had changed as well. Now, beside the house he had recognized as his, he could see the blind man standing. His posture was that of someone waiting for something. And suddenly, Maddie could see, too, crowds of people at the edge of the village. They were dragging huge logs. Someone, it looked like Mentor, was giving directions. They were preparing to build a wall. Maddie sat back. He blinked, astounded, then leaned forward to look at it again. He realized he wanted to search the scene for a glimpse of Jean, but now the details were gone. He could still see the colored stitches, but it was a simple, exquisitely beautiful, but simple landscape again. For a moment he saw the people, flat now with no detail, but then they faded abruptly and were gone. Kira set the embroidery frame down on the floor and rose from her chair. "We must leave in the morning," she said. "I'll prepare food." Maddie was still stunned by what he had just seen. "I don't understand," he said. "Do you understand what happened when you stabbed your knee with that knife and then closed and cured the wound with your hands?" "No," he admitted. "I don't. It's my gift. That's all." "Well," Kira said matter-of-factly, "this is mine. My hands create a picture of the future. Yesterday morning I held that same fabric and saw you come out of forest. In the afternoon I opened the door and there you were." She chuckled. "I hadn't seen Frolic, though. He was a nice surprise." The dog awoke and looked up at the sound of his name. He came to her to be patted. "While you napped," she went on, "I stitched again and saw Father waiting for me. That was just this afternoon. Now they have started to move the logs into place for the wall. And did you notice the change in forest, Maddie?" He shook his head. "I was looking at the people. Forest is thickening, so we must hurry, Maddie." Odd. It was the same thing the leader had seen. "Kira?" Maddie asked. Yes, she was taking food from a cupboard. "Did you see a young man with blue eyes? About your age. We called him Leader." She stood still for a moment, thinking. A strand of dark hair fell across her face, and she brushed it back with her hand. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, "but I felt him." 15. They woke early. The sun was just rising, and through the window Maddie could see that the gardens were bathed in amber light. Thick around a tall trellis, a vine that had been simply green when he arrived the day before was now profuse with opened blue and white morning glories. Beyond the trellis, on tall stalks, tiny aster blossoms, deep pink with golden centers, trembled in the dawn breeze. He felt her presence suddenly and turned to see Kira standing behind him looking out. "It'll be hard for you to leave this," he said. But she smiled and shook her head. "It's time. I always knew the time would come. I told my father that long ago." "He says you'll have a garden there. He wanted me to tell you that." She nodded. "Eat quickly, Maddie, and we'll go. I fed Frolic already." "Do you need help?" Maddie asked, his mouth full of sweet muffins she had given him, as he watched her arrange a wrapped bundle on her back, crisscrossing the straps that held it around her chest. "What's in it?" "No, I can do it just fine. It's my frame and some needles and thread." "Kira, the journey is hard and long. There won't be time to sit and saw." Then Maddie fell quiet. Of course, she needed this. It was the way her gift came. She had put food inside Maddie's pack as well as in his rolled blanket. It was heavier than it had been coming, for there were 2 of them now. But Maddie felt strong. He was almost relieved that she had not allowed him to mend her leg, for it would have weakened him badly, cost him perhaps several days as he rested from it, and sent him out less prepared and more vulnerable. He could see, too, that she was accustomed to her stick and twisted leg. A lifetime of walking in that way had made it, as she had pointed out, part of her. It was who she was. To become a fast-riding Kira with 2 straight legs would have been to become a different person. This was not a journey Maddie could undertake with a stranger. "Frolic, if you were a little bigger and less frisky, I would strap a pack to your back," Kira said, laughing, to the eager puppy, who stood beside the door with his tail turning in the air. He could tell they were leaving. He was not going to be left behind. Soon they were loaded with everything they had packed so carefully the night before. "We're ready then," Kira announced, and Maddie nodded in agreement. From the open doorway, with Frolic already outside sniffing the earth, they looked back to the large room that had been Kira's home since she had been a young girl. She was leaving the loom, the baskets of yarn and thread, the dried herbs on the rafters, the wall hangings, the earthen mugs and plates made for her by the village potter, and a handsome wooden tray that had been a gift long ago from her friend Thomas, who had carved it with the intertwined, complicated designs. From hooks along the wall hung her clothes, things she had made, some of them skirts and jackets, and with embroidered and appliqued designs. Today she was wearing her simple blue dress and a heavy knitted sweater with buttons made from small flat stones. She closed the door on all of it. "Come, Frolic," Maddie called, unnecessarily. The dog scampered to them and raised his leg one last time against the doorsill, saying, in his way, "I have been here." Then Maddie moved toward the place where the path entered the forest. Kira, on her stick, followed him, and Frolic, ears up, came behind. "You know," Kira said, "I've walked the forest path between this cottage and the center of my village so many times." Then she laughed. "Well, of course you know that, Maddie. You did it with me when you were a little boy." "I did, again and again. But I have never once entered the forest. There was no need, of course, and it always seemed frightening somehow." They had barely entered, and behind them the light of the clearing still showed, and a corner of Kira's little house. But ahead Maddie could see. The path was oddly dark. He didn't remember it being so dark. "Are you frightened now?" he asked her. "Oh no, not with you. You know forest so well." "That's true, I do." It was true, but even as he said it, Maddie felt a sense of discomfort, though he hid it from Kira. The path ahead did not seem to be as familiar as it had always been. He could tell that it was the same path. The turnings were the same. As he led her around the next one, the clearing behind them was no longer visible. But things that had seemed easy and accustomed no longer did. Now everything felt a little different, slightly darker and decidedly hostile. But he said nothing. He led the way, and Kira, strong despite her handicap, trudged after him. "They have entered." Leader turned from the window. He had stood there for a long moment, intent, focused, while beside him the blind man waited. They had been doing this for several days. Leader sat to rest. He breathed hard. He was accustomed to this, the way his body temporarily lost its vigor and needed some restore itself after he had looked beyond. The blind man gave a sigh that was clearly one of relief. So she came with him. Leader nodded, still not ready to talk. I worried that she wouldn't. It meant leaving so much behind, but Maddie convinced her. Good for him. Leader stretched and sipped from the glass of water on his desk. Then he was able to speak. She didn't need convincing. She could tell that it was time. She has that gift. The blind man went to the window and stood there listening. Heavy dragging sounds and thuds were accompanied by shouts. Over here! Put it down there! Watch out! They could hear Mentor's voice, loud above the others. Stack them right there, he directed. 5 to a stack. You idiot! Stop that. If you aren't going to help, go someplace else. Leader winced. It was such a short time ago that he was so patient and soft-spoken. Listen to him now. Tell me how he looks, the blind man said. Leader went to the window and looked down at the place where they were preparing to build the wall. He found Mentor in the crowd. His bald spot is completely gone, he said. He's taller, or at least stands straighter. He's lost weight, and his chin is firmer than he was. A strange trait for him to have made, the blind man commented. Leader shrugged. For a woman, he pointed out, people do strange things. I suppose it's too soon for you to look beyond again. The blind man was still at the window. His posture was uneasy. Leader smiled. You know it is. They've only just entered. They're fine. How much time do they have? 10 days. The wall can't go off for 10 days, according to the edict. It's enough time. Matt is like a son to me. It's as if both my children are out there. I know. Leader put a reassuring arm across the blind man's shoulders. Come back here tomorrow morning and we'll look again. I'll go work in my garden. I'm preparing flower beds for Kira. Good idea. It'll take your mind from the worry. But when Seer had gone, Leader stood at the window for a while, listening to the wall builders at their preparations. He was very worried himself. He had not told the blind man, but while he had watched Maddie, Kira, and the puppy enter Forest, he had been able to see, too, that Forest was shifting, moving, thickening, and preparing to destroy them.